But shifting now from this specific amendment, I'd like to talk a little about the amendment process in general and the position we find ourselves in today in this body. At their core, amendments afforded on the floor serve as an opportunity to not only thoroughly debate an issue. We all know that legislation is often brought to the floor having only the benefit of input from just a few members. So what amendments do is provide individual senators a chance to change and often improve legislation. They are a right in this body, not a privilege. I believe in this fundamental process so strongly that I've supported controversial cloture motions and other motions to proceed to underline bills, even if I didn't support that legislation, but simply on good faith assurances that amendments would be offered and that amendment debate would be allowed. Even though I didn't support the bill as it stood, I would at least have the opportunity to make it better through an open legislative process. That's how I felt on a number of pieces of legislation that have moved through this body. Unfortunately, many of these assurances were not met, and my fear is that this body will continue to pass legislation with little to no amendment consideration. Now, since last July, Republicans have only had 11 roll call votes on amendments, including the 2 we'll see today. By comparison, in the other body, House Democrats have had over 160 votes on amendments during that same period, 160 for the minority party in the House of Representatives. That's more than 14 times the votes that Senate Republicans have had. As my good friend from Kentucky pointed out earlier, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has single-handedly received more amendment votes than all Senate Republicans, given that she's had 15 votes on her amendments since last July in the House of Representatives. Now, some who lionize this chamber, and I'm one of those, as the world's most deliberative body, often take a dim view to the practice of the House. I'm not one of those, but this is supposed to be the more deliberative body with open amendments and open debate. They will cite with trepidation the restrictive and structured approach to debate in the House, and with a shudder, the very fact that the House has the dreaded Rules Committee that picks and chooses which amendments will be offered. I can tell you from experience, when it comes to the ability to offer amendments, I now long for those days in the House. During my service in the House between the 107th and 112th Congress, I personally offered, this is offered, not filed, but offered on the floor of the House of Representatives, 239 amendments. In fact, in the last 4 Congresses, I offered between 30 and 70 amendments per Congress. Now, outside of the sheer volume, one could reasonably chuckle at my amendment batting average, since very few of my amendments passed. But I actually had more amendments adopted in the past 2 Congresses each than we've had roll call votes on Republicans' amendments in the Senate since July. Now, under both Republican and Democratic leadership in the House, my right to offer amendments, particularly during the appropriation process, were respected. They were respected by both parties, even when I was offering dozens of earmark limitation amendments that most of my colleagues preferred not see the light of day. Many of my colleagues here in the Senate served with me in the House. They'll remember those times. Nobody wanted to vote on Flake amendments. These earmark limitation amendments were not popular. They often did not get many votes. But in fact, in all but one of the 140 earmark limitation amendments I offered, they failed, all but one. But I think we can all agree that joining with a small handful of my colleagues to spotlight precisely what was going on in these appropriations bills ultimately aided in the current earmark moratorium that is enforced by both houses. That's a good thing. While I prefer to have my amendments prevail, it certainly shouldn't be the test for whether I'm afforded the ability to offer them. Unfortunately, in my short time in the Senate, I've filed 85 amendments to improve underlying legislation and to address issues faced by my constituents. It's worth noting that this will be my first amendment that will be voted on by my colleagues. During last year's NDAA consideration, I filed an amendment that would simply ask DOD to report on OCO spending. The amendment would have required an accounting of OCO funds. This is appropriated during FY 2013 and requested in 2014, and would have withheld 10% from the budget for the Office of the Secretary of Defense until the report was received. This amendment isn't a fundamental policy change, it's simply a reporting requirement that all of us would benefit from. Last week, I filed 30 amendments to the minibus appropriations bill, but not one is likely to see the light of day. With no disrespect to my colleagues, and having served on the Appropriations Committee in the House myself, I think we can all agree that spending bills benefit from a good scrubbing by this entire body before they move through the legislative process. For example, one of those amendments would have reduced the USDA single-family housing direct loan program from $560 million to $360 million, the same amount as is in the President's budget. I think most of us would be surprised to learn that the Department of Agriculture has a single-family housing direct loan program, and that we're funding it to the tune of $560 million. The President wants to move that down to $360 million. I agree with the President. At least we ought to be allowed to debate it and vote on it. This isn't an outlandish amendment. It would simply reduce funding levels to the President's request, and more importantly, give this body the opportunity to discuss the merits of the program. I know that some of my colleagues will disagree and will ultimately oppose many of these amendments and others if they come to a vote, and that's fine. What is not fine is the fact that we in the United States Senate can't even have that debate. And to be clear, this is not just a Republican concern. A recent article in The Hill mentioned how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are seemingly just as frustrated with the current amendment process. The article included a quote from a Democratic senator who said, quote, "I've never been in a less productive time in my life than I'm in right now in the United States Senate." So apparently I should count myself lucky to get a roll call today on this amendment, because there are many on the other side of the aisle who haven't been afforded the same luxury. Both Democrats and Republicans are getting shut out of this process, and it's a very dangerous precedent. I urge my colleagues to encourage thoughtful, open debate from here on out, and I also encourage support from my common sense reform to the accountability provisions of this legislation we are debating today. Madam President, I yield the floor.